Imagine going to bed tonight feeling perfectly fine. You've had a productive day, your family is safe, and the world feels stable. But at 3:00 a.m., you wake up drenched in a cold, unnatural sweat. Your throat feels like it's being constricted by invisible hands. You reach down to your neck and feel it a hard, throbbing lump, the size of an apple burning with a fever that defies logic. By dawn, your skin begins to turn a bruised, sickly purple. By noon, your breathing is a ragged crawl. And by sunset, you are gone. Now imagine this isn't just happening to you. It's happening to your neighbor, your priest, your children. Imagine the church bells ringing so relentlessly for the dead that the city council eventually bans them not out of respect, but because the constant tolling is driving the survivors into madness. This wasn't a horror movie. This was the reality of the year 1347. This was the Great Mortality. We often talk about the end of the world as a futuristic trope, a collection of pixels in a Hollywood blockbuster. But for the people of the 14th century, the apocalypse didn't have a trailer. It arrived in the hold of a spice ship, invisible and hungry. It was a biological predator so efficient that it didn't just kill people. It deleted entire genealogies from existence in a matter of weeks. What you were never told in history class is that this wasn't just a bad flu or a lack of hygiene. It was the ultimate test of human civilization, a moment where every system we relied on, from religion to government to the basic bond between a parent and child, utterly collapsed. In the next 8 chapters, we are going deep. We aren't just looking at the dates and the body counts. We are stepping into the narrow, sewage-drenched alleys of medieval London. We are boarding the death ships fleeing the siege of Caffa. We are witnessing the moment humanity looked into the abyss and realized the abyss was looking back. But before we get to the blood and the charcoal pits, we have to ask, how did a world that was arguably at its peak, vibrant, interconnected, and optimistic, become the perfect laboratory for its own destruction? The answer lies thousands of Prost, miles away in the silent, windswept heart of Asia. And the trigger was a change in the weather. If you think you know the story of the Black Death, forget everything, because the reality is far more terrifying than the myth. And it all started with a single flea. Stay tuned as we unlock the first gate of the apocalypse. To understand how the world died, we have to look at the killer under a microscope. Meet Yersinia pestis. Pause. It is a gram-negative, non-motile bacterium that looks harmless enough to a tiny rod-shaped organism. But inside this microscopic shell lies a biological masterpiece of destruction. When a flea infected with Yersinia bites a host, the bacteria doesn't just enter the bloodstream. It's smarter than that. It travels to the nearest lymph node, the body's security outpost, and turns it into a factory for its own replication. It hijacks your immune system, preventing your white blood cells from signaling for backup. The lymph node swells into a bubo, a black, agonizing cyst that eventually liquefies into a toxic sludge of blood and bacteria. This is a predator that evolved over millennia for one purpose: total systemic takeover. But for centuries, this killer was trapped. It lived in a fragile ecological stalemate in the vast, high-altitude steppes of Central Asia, modern-day Kyrgyzstan. It survived within the rodent populations, marmots and ground squirrels, who had developed a partial immunity. It was a biological secret kept hidden by the isolation of the mountains. Then the world changed. In the early 1300s, a period of erratic climate shifts. The end of the medieval warm period hit the steppes. Massive droughts, followed by torrential rains, destroyed the rodents' food sources. Driven by starvation, millions of infected marmots began to migrate, moving closer to the only source of food left: human settlements and their grain stores. This was the spark. But the Mongol Empire provided the fuel. Under the Pax Mongolica, the Mongols had created the most efficient trade network in human history. The Silk Road wasn't just a path for silk and spices, it was a high-speed conveyor belt for the plague. Caravanserais, the medieval equivalent of truck stops, became death traps. A merchant would sleep in a room where an infected rat had died hours before. The fleas, sensing the loss of their warm host, would jump onto the merchant's robes, his saddlebags, or his bales of cloth. Within weeks, that merchant would be hundreds of miles away, coughing into his hand as he entered a new city. He was a biological time bomb, and he didn't even know he had been triggered. By the time the first rumors reached the West, the East was already a graveyard. Reports filtered into Europe of rains of fire in China, of India being depopulated, of the Great Khan's armies melting away. But the Europeans, secure in their stone cathedrals, dismissed it as Eastern chaos or God's wrath on the heathens. They didn't realize that the very system that made them rich, the interconnected world of trade, was now the very thing that would ensure their extinction. The killer was no longer in the mountains. It was on the road, and it was heading for a fortress called Caffa. The year is 1346. The setting Caffa, a glittering jewel of the Genoese Empire on the edge of the Black Sea. For years, this city was a fortress of wealth, protected by massive limestone walls and the finest Italian crossbowmen. But outside those walls, the horizon is a sea of felt tents and horsehair banners. The Golden Horde, led by Khan Jani Beg, has surrounded the city. But this wasn't a normal siege. Inside the Mongol camps, a silent mutiny was happening. Soldiers weren't falling to Genoese bolts. They were collapsing in their tents, their bodies turning black, their lungs filling with fluid. The plague had finally caught up with the conquerors. Faced with an army that was literally rotting away, Jani Beg realized he couldn't take Caffa by force. So he decided to take it by horror. Imagine you are a Genoese sentry standing on the battlements. You hear the familiar creak of the Mongol trebuchets, massive catapults designed to shatter stone walls. You brace for the impact of boulders. But when the projectiles fly through the air, they don't look like rocks. They are limp. They are heavy. And they are screaming not with voices but with the stench of decay. Jani Beg was launching the plague-ridden corpses of his own soldiers over the walls. One after another, hundreds of infected bodies smashed into the city squares, onto the roofs of houses, and into the very wells the citizens drank from. The air was instantly thick with the miasma of the dead. The Genoese tried to throw the bodies back into the sea, but it was useless. The bacteria were already there. The fleas were already finding new warm hosts among the terrified population. This was the first recorded act of large-scale biological warfare in history, and it worked perfectly. Panic didn't just spread, it ignited. As the first buboes appeared on the necks of the city's elite, the realization hit Caffa was no longer a fortress, it was a coffin. In a desperate bid for survival, 12 Genoese galleys managed to slip out of the harbor under the cover of darkness. They were filled with refugees, gold and spices, heading back to the safety of Italy. But they were carrying a stowaway they couldn't see. In the dark corners of the wooden hulls among the sacks of grain, the black rats were breeding, and on those rats the fleas were waiting. These 12 ships were no longer merchant vessels, they were death ships. As they sailed through the Mediterranean, they stopped at ports to resupply Constantinople, Messina, Genoa. At every stop, the mooring ropes became bridges. The rats scurried off the ships and into the bustling European docks. By the time the port authorities in Messina realized the horror on board, finding ships full of dead men at the oars, it was already too late. The invisible executioner had stepped onto European soil. The gates of hell were now wide open, and the rest of the continent was next. As the death ships docked and the rats scurried into the streets of Europe, a second, more invisible plague began to spread, the plague of fear. In the 14th century, the family was the center of the universe. It was your safety net, your identity, your soul. But as the Black Death tore through cities like Florence and Paris, that net didn't just fray, it snapped. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio sat in the middle of this nightmare and recorded words that still haunt historians today. He wrote, "Brother abandoned brother." And oftentimes the father did not even visit his son. Think about that. The most primal bond in nature, the instinct of a parent to protect their child, was deleted by the sheer terror of the bubo. People didn't stay to comfort the dying. They fled. They locked their sick relatives in their rooms and boarded up the doors, listening to their screams of thirst and pain until the silence took over. Compassion became a luxury that no one could afford. As the social fabric dissolved, the physical city began to rot. Modern urban life is a delicate machine of supply and demand, and in 1348, that machine ground to a halt. Courts of law closed because there were no judges. Bakeries stood empty because the bakers were dead. The vibrant, chaotic sounds of a medieval metropolis were replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence, interrupted only by the creak of wooden wheels. These were the death carts. Every morning, men, often criminals who were forced into the job because no one else would do it, walked the streets, shouting, "Bring out your dead." The bodies were piled high on these carts like cordwood. In the beginning, they were given Christian burials, but within weeks the consecrated ground of the churchyards was full. The dead were overflowing. This led to the creation of the plague pits, massive gaping trenches dug outside the city walls. Archaeologists today still find them. They find layers upon layer of skeletons stacked 5 or 6 deep, covered in a thin dusting of quicklime to accelerate the decay and stifle the stench. These weren't just graves. They were evidence of a civilization that had run out of time, space, and dignity. By the time the plague hit its peak, the authorities stopped counting. In some cities, 60% of the population vanished in a single season. The living were so few and so exhausted by grief that they simply sat in the streets, waiting for their own turn to die. But as the physical world crumbled, people looked to the only thing they had left: their faith. They flooded the cathedrals, begging God for mercy. What they didn't realize was that by huddling together in the dark, damp pews, they were creating the perfect environment for the pneumonic plague, the airborne version of the killer to jump from person to person. Their prayers weren't bringing salvation, they were bringing more death. And as the priests themselves began to die in droves, a terrifying question began to echo in every mind. If the holy men are dying, has God truly abandoned us? In the 14th century, the brightest minds in the world weren't scientists, they were philosophers and theologians. And when the Black Death arrived, these experts were as helpless as the rats in the gutter. If you walked into a doctor's office in 1348, you wouldn't find germ theory or antibiotics. Instead, you'd find the University of Paris officially declaring that the plague was caused by a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius. According to them, the stars had corrupted the air, creating a poisonous vapor called miasma. Their solution: don't breathe, or at least, don't breathe the bad air. People began carrying pomanders, balls of amber, musk, and dried flowers pressed to their noses at all times, hoping a sweet smell could act as a shield against death. But the bacteria didn't care about the scent of roses. As the bodies piled up, medical treatments descended into pure, terrifying madness. Since doctors believed the body's humors were out of balance, they practiced bloodletting on patients who were already dying of dehydration and internal bleeding. They used leeches until the victims grew pale and limp, and then it got weirder. Some doctors prescribed the Vickery method. They would pluck the feathers from the underside of a live pigeon and press the bird's bare skin against the patient's swollen buboes. The idea was that the bird would draw out the poison. Of course, the only thing it did was ensure the bird died, and the patient died shortly after, now covered in bird droppings and feathers. Others suggested drinking potable gold, liquid gold mixed with crushed pearls. It was a remedy only the ultra-wealthy could afford, essentially paying a fortune to swallow heavy metals that further destroyed their kidneys while the plague finished off their lungs. For the poor, the advice was simpler. Sit in a room filled with the smoke of dried cow dung or bathe in your own urine. This wasn't just bad medicine, it was a total collapse of human reason. But the greatest casualty wasn't the body, it was the soul. The church, the absolute bedrock of medieval life, was failing. People watched as the most devout priests, the ones who stayed to give last rites, died faster than the sinners they were praying for. If the intermediaries of God were being struck down like dogs, what hope was there for the average person? A profound, dark cynicism began to take root. For some, this led to the danse macabre, a realization that death was the ultimate equalizer coming for the king and the peasant alike. For others, it led to a total abandonment of morality. If you were going to die tomorrow, why follow the 10 Commandments today? The world was becoming a place where logic, medicine, and faith had all vanished, leaving only a raw, naked struggle for one more hour of breath. But in the shadows of this despair, a much darker movement was forming. If God wasn't listening, people decided it was time to find someone or something to blame. When science fails and God is silent, the human mind doesn't just stop, it breaks. It enters a state of primal, frantic survival. And in the 1340s, that break took the form of a terrifying, bloody spectacle. Listen. Sound of rhythmic, heavy thuds and chanting. That sound echoed through the streets of Germany, France, and the Netherlands. It was the sound of the flagellants. Imagine a procession of hundreds of men, dressed in identical white robes, marked with red crosses, marching slowly into your town square. They don't speak to you. They don't ask for food. Instead, they strip to the waist, lie face down on the cold stone, and begin to scream for mercy. Then they stand up and begin to whip themselves. They use heavy leather scourges tipped with iron spikes, They swing them over their shoulders until the spikes sink into the flesh of their backs and pull out pieces of skin. They do this twice a day, every day for 33 days, one day for every year Christ lived on earth. They believed that by taking the sins of the world onto their own bleeding backs, they could appease a God who was clearly trying to wipe out humanity. They were a traveling circus of trauma, and everywhere they went, they brought religious hysteria. People didn't just watch, they joined. They dipped cloths in the flagellant's blood, believing it was holy. But the hysteria needed more than just self-inflicted pain. It needed a target. It needed a villain you could see, touch, and destroy. A dark, venomous conspiracy theory began to spread like wildfire through the Holy Roman Empire. The Jews were poisoning the wells. Think about the absurdity. The Jewish communities were dying of the plague at the exact same rate as the Christians. Even Pope Clement VI issued a decree pointing this out, calling the accusation a lie from the devil. But logic had no place in a world of plague pits. In Strasbourg, in Mainz, in Cologne, the mob mentality took over. In February 1349, the citizens of Strasbourg rounded up 2,000 Jewish men, women, and children. They took them to the cemetery, built a massive wooden platform, and burned them all alive. Those who weren't burned were chased into their homes, which were then set on fire. Entire centuries of culture and community were erased in a single afternoon of bloodlust. Similar massacres happened in over 60 major Jewish communities across Europe. The Black Death had unleashed two viruses, one that destroyed the lungs and one that destroyed the soul. As the fires died down and the screams of the persecuted faded, the plague remained. The blood of the flagellants didn't stop the bacteria. The ashes of the innocent didn't purify the wells. The killer didn't care about your penance or your prejudice. It was still moving deeper into the countryside, into the villages that thought they were safe because they were far from the ports. It was about to turn the entire European landscape into a wilderness. While the cities of Europe were the roaring furnaces of the plague, the countryside was a slow, agonizing burn. In the 14th century, 90% of the population lived in small rural villages. They thought their isolation was a shield. They were wrong. The Black Death traveled along the arteries of the medieval world, not just by ship, but by cart, by foot, and by the very animals that sustained life. As refugees fled the plague-choked streets of London or Paris, they carried the invisible killer into the heart of the wilderness. Imagine walking through the English countryside in the autumn of 1349. You come across a village. From a distance, it looks peaceful. The thatched roofs are intact, the church spire reaches toward the grey sky. But as you get closer, you notice the silence. There are no blacksmiths hammering iron, no children shouting, no barking dogs. You enter a cottage, and the smell hits you, the heavy, sweet stench of advanced decay. Inside, an entire family lies in their beds, frozen in their final moments of agony. Outside, the scene is even more surreal. The harvest, the precious wheat and rye that should have fed the region through winter, is rotting in the fields. The stalks are doubled over black with mold because there is no one left to swing the scythe. This was the birth of the lost villages. Historians estimate that thousands of rural settlements simply vanished from the map during these years. In England alone, over 3,000 villages were abandoned and never reoccupied. Today, if you fly over parts of Europe, you can still see the ghostly outlines of these streets and foundations beneath the grass, the skeletal remains of a murdered society. And then there were the animals. Contemporary chroniclers describe eerie scenes of thousands of sheep and cattle wandering aimlessly through the hills. Their shepherds were dead in their huts. These animals, left to fend for themselves, began to die of neglect or were hunted by wolves that had grown bold. The wolves, sensing the retreat of humanity, moved into the village squares. For the first time in centuries, the wilderness was reclaiming the land. The boundary between civilization and the wild had dissolved. In the far north, the plague reached the isolated Norse colonies of Greenland. Already struggling with a cooling climate, the Black Death was the final blow. The supply ships stopped coming. The settlers died in their stone houses. The silence of the Arctic took over, erasing a Viking expansion that had lasted centuries. By 1350, the plague had reached the edge of the known world. It had burned through the frozen fjords of Norway and the highlands of Scotland. Europe was no longer a vibrant collection of kingdoms. It was a vast, silent graveyard. The initial catastrophic wave was finally beginning to exhaust itself, not because of medicine or prayer, but because the bacterium was running out of people to kill. But as the fog of death began to lift, The survivors stepped out into a world that looked familiar but felt entirely alien. The nightmare was ending, but the transformation of the human race had just begun. By 1351, the fires of the Black Death began to cool. The predator had run out of prey. But as the survivors crawled out from their boarded-up homes, they didn't find the world they remembered. They found a world that had been violently, permanently reset. If you survived the plague, you were now part of the most valuable group in history. Before the disaster, Europe was overpopulated, and peasants were treated as disposable tools. But now, with half the workforce in the plague pits, the survivors realized they held the ultimate leverage. For the first time in centuries, the rigid walls of serfdom began to crumble. Lords, desperate to harvest their lands, were forced to offer higher wages, better food, and even freedom. This was the golden age of the laborer. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed the feudal system. It paved the way for a new middle class and the concept of individual worth. The psychological impact was even more profound. The total failure of the church and the medical establishment led to a massive shift in human thought. People stopped looking only to the heavens for answers and started looking at the world around them. This newfound skepticism and the sudden influx of inherited wealth fueled the greatest cultural explosion in history, the Renaissance. From the ashes of the greatest trauma came the art of Michelangelo, the inventions of Da Vinci, and the birth of modern science. We often forget that the light of the Renaissance was ignited by the darkness of the 14th century, but the Black Death never truly left us. It retreated into the shadows, returning every few generations like a ghost, reminding humanity of its fragility. It taught us the concept of quarantine, the 40 giorni, or 40 days of isolation pioneered in Venice. It taught us that a virus in a distant land is everyone's problem. Today, we walk the same streets that were once piled with bodies. We live in a world built on the foundations laid by those who survived the unimaginable. The Black Death was the ultimate test of our species. It showed us the darkest depths of our nature, the abandonment of children, the massacres of the innocent, the total collapse of reason. But it also showed our incredible ability to adapt, to rebuild, and to find meaning in the ruins. As we look at the empty streets of our own modern history, the locked homes, and the fear of the very air we breathe, we have to ask ourselves, have we really learned the lesson, or are we just waiting for the next cycle to begin? Because history doesn't just repeat, it rhymes. And the next great mortality might not arrive on a ship. It might already be among us, hidden in a cough, a flea, or a laboratory. My friends and I are observing the past so that we can understand the present, and together we keep history alive. See you in the next era. The Black Death changed everything. But what do you think was the most terrifying part of this story? Let me know in the comments. And if you're brave enough to explore more dark corners of history, hit that subscribe button. The past is waiting.